Good evening and good day to everybody, wherever you're listening to us or watching us from. Thank you so much for tuning in. I would say Happy Mental Health Awareness Month. We are here today talking about mental health, and I have beautiful ladies here who are actually going to help us set the basis and give us the foundation of what mental health is all about and kind of take out the little confusions that we usually have surrounding the whole topic of mental health. So I'm going to let them present themselves to you guys. They are very smart. I am so happy actually to have them all here, so knowledgeable. And so I think we're going to start with Liz since she's new on our panel today. So we'll start with Liz.
Yeah. Well, I'm Liz. I am LCPC, so licensed clinical professional counselor. I work in Chicago. I have a couple of specialties. The main ones are couples and then trauma. So I work with a lot of religious trauma, like a lot of people who have experienced like exclusion and like discrimination for like being LGBTQ in the church or other things like that. And I also do EMDR, so eye movement desensitization reprocessing. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a form of trauma therapy that helps like heal your brain from the different traumatic things that you've been through and work through like the different negative beliefs that you have about yourself because of trauma.
Okay, thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here tonight.
Glad to
And
be here.
thank you. I'm going to let Cynthia present herself next and just your professional background for the viewers as well.
Yeah, so my name is Ogichi Onyeka, but I go by Cynthia, and I'm a PhD candidate in clinical psychology. My main focuses are with children, so I am studying clinical child psychology, and I work primarily with kids and teens, mainly working with kids who've been exposed to complex trauma.
Oh wow, it's getting hot in here. Okay, and then we have Nev. Neftali, would you present yourself and your professional background as well for the viewers?
Yeah. So my name is Neftali Lesperance. I go by Nef usually. I have a master's in social work from Loyola University Chicago. Also, my a second major was in social justice. So my focus is a lot on like leadership and staff development and nonprofit organizations type of work. I'm also specialized in group work, so I really enjoy doing a variety of different things involving group work, whether it's like doing task groups or treatment groups where you're doing a lot of self development, things like that. Um, and then I also have a little bit of like the clinical background where I did some therapy with high schoolers essentially. So yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Before we actually dive too deep into this, I don't want to lose anybody who's watching. So maybe there's somebody who's watching who probably doesn't know so much about mental health. So I wanted us to start off by kind of giving them an explanation of what is mental health. And since I have ladies in almost three different departments, but still working in mental health in a way, can you guys help our audience understand what mental health is, especially in your specific departments? So we'll start with Liz since she's already unmuted and ready to go.
Awesome. So I feel like it's a really big question because it like captures a lot. But what I like had written down was like the journey of like becoming mentally healthy, like working towards our emotional, psychological, and relational well-being. Yeah. So a really big way that I've seen this actually this past year with like COVID and like being virtual is I actually started like group therapy, and that's been like really healing for a lot of my clients to have like that like relational health of like being able to process what's been going on this year.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And Cynthia, what would you say is mental health in your department and your sphere of work?
Yeah, I think just like Liz said, that's a really good question, and I think it's can be as broad or as deep as I think one may want it to be. But specifically with clinical psychology, my field is more so focused on psychopathology, and since I work with kids, kind of looking at emotional and behavioral functioning for kids that are a little more non-adaptive or impairing of their functioning. So that's kind of where my line of mental health comes from, but the idea of like promoting well-being so that you can work and perform and live at your most optimal state, or at least getting close to that point, is also a definition of mental health too.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also learning just here, just seeing the difference already from your explanation. So I'm actually anticipating Nef's response. What is mental health in your department and your work?
I was about to say, don't anticipate too hard. So basically, I think Liz and Cynthia's explanations are pretty much similar. I think the difference with social work is we don't always look so much at the psychopathology. We kind of focus more on the person's strengths, and we kind of go from there to kind of help them figure out like how can they build capacity to like deal with life stressors that kind of come at you. So I know for everybody this past year it has been COVID, so figuring out how do I deal with the life stressor of COVID, whether, and then if it comes down to like dealing with unemployment, whatever, like what ways can you help build that person up to look at the things that they're already good at to kind of build those things. And then I just wanted to highlight too, so for I think all of our fields, but I know with social work, we kind of do it in different ways. So it's like we can do preventative measures where we're like, okay, um, let's try to find ways to help you build capacity so you can prevent, like, let's say if something comes up that can cause maybe cause you to feel symptoms of depression, you can kind of know how to deal with that ahead of time before it happens. Or we look at treatment, so maybe if you already have those symptoms of depression, how can we help treat those things so we can reduce like how much it impairs you from doing like your day-to-day stuff. Or we look at like maybe like doing some rehabilitation, so that maybe that looks like how to reduce like the after effects or the dysfunction that kind of came out of those symptoms. So there's different ways that you can kind of go about it, and I think all three of us kind of do that within our fields. But I was going to highlight, so for social work, like I know there's different ways that we go about doing it. So some of us do like direct services, so we're doing like one-on-one therapy, we're doing groups, so that's very similar to psychology and licensed therapists. But then also there's some of us that do like case management, so maybe that means connecting people to resources that can help them promote their mental health. Or there's like creating programs that can kind of you know help the whole community as a whole. So those are just like some things that um, we kind of do in social work.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as I'm listening to you guys, you're kind of talking about mental health and the well-being and kind of being healthy, so to say. So in a way, when we talk about mental illnesses, that would be the opposite of a healthy state. So I was hoping that maybe before we start talking more about mental illnesses, that we would kind of clear up the little confusion that we usually have between using the words mental health, mental illness, mental disorders. Can you guys give us the right ways in which we can use those words? Because I think so many times we use them interchangeably, and you don't really know what word to use when. Because it's like, okay, do I say this is an illness, this is a disorder, and all of that? So I think I'm going to ask Cynthia to help us kind of clear up the difference between all of that, and how do we use these words, especially when you're working with a person. How do I use these words without also making a person feel like I'm labeling them as this ill person in a stigmatic way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think kind of like what we were talking about before with mental health as a state of being, as like our, a healthy state. Like that's kind of the default to have like promotive mental health. And when I think of mental illness and mental disorders, depending on who I'm working with or the context, I would use them interchangeably. But I do recognize that with mental illness, there can be some stigma associated with that term. So when I think about mental illness or mental disorder, it's any type of area of emotional, behavioral, or psychological condition or functioning that's impairing how that person is able to act and perform in their day-to-day activities. If anything related to their mental health, such as like depression or anxiety or anything like that, is inhibiting them or keeping them from performing in their daily functioning, then that would be, in my case, a mental illness or a mental disorder. But if it's not, then that's just something that can be up to interpretation, again, because mental illness is so stigmatizing. We don't want to pathologize people's behaviors or actions, especially kind of given cultural context and things like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, as you're talking about that, in my head, I'm just thinking, who can develop such illnesses or such disorders? I think there is this thing that when we talk about the poor, we usually like to bring this up and say, hey, they might have anxiety or they might lean towards substance abuse. But um, are the poor the only people that actually experience mental illnesses and mental disorders? Who else can experience it? What about age? Does age affect a person experiencing it, or does age kind of protect you from experiencing it? So I just wanted us to dive a bit more on who can actually develop a mental illness or a mental disorder. And I was hoping Liz would help us kind of explain that.
Yeah, I think the answer is anybody, regardless of like your race, gender, economic status, age. Unfortunately, it can happen to anyone at any time, regardless of those different factors.
Thank you so much for that. And as you're just responding that, in my head, I'm just thinking, why don't we talk about it then if anybody can experience it? Because I think sometimes it's like, I don't know, a taboo topic and everybody kind of walks on eggshells when it comes to mental health and mental illnesses. Why don't we talk about it? When we do research, it says that 1 in 5 adults are prone to actually experience a mental health or a mental illness or a mental disorder in their life. And now with the pandemic, we know that it's probably more than 1 in 5 people. And so why don't we talk so much about it? I was hoping Nef would help us kind of dive deep in why is this topic not talked about so much in our communities, in our schools, in our families, in our churches.
Yeah. And I know we will talk deeper about some of that in some of our next, I guess episodes of this. But I think a lot for the longest time, like there's always been stigma around the topic of mental illness or mental disorders. Especially like I know all of us here are from like a church background. So like usually if somebody's struggling with mental illness, there's this thing of like, oh, maybe they sinned or maybe they're not praying enough or it's always like there's always something that people kind of blame it on, and instead of actually sitting with it and be like, hey, maybe there could be really a chemical thing going on, or maybe they were responding to trauma or something, like there's a reason for it. And so I think because there is this stigma around mental health and mental disorder, a lot of times people shy away from the topic. Sometimes I think it's just because like people just really genuinely don't know what to do or say about it, which I guess is understandable, but also I think people don't realize the more we shy away from talking about this, there's people out here that are like suffering with it silently. And like Liz says, like it affects everybody. So you don't know who could be going through this silently. And because we're not talking about it, we unfortunately sometimes see that people end up taking their lives and all these other things or self-medicating because they don't have the resources available to deal with those things. I don't know if like Liz or Cynthia want to add more to that, but I think that's my initial reaction to why we don't talk about it.
I've also noticed, especially this past year, for some reason, that a lot of times, for at least my clients who've been through like trauma, there's a lot of like minimizing of like their own trauma that they've been through. So like for some of my clients, they don't even really like to talk about their mental illness because they're like, oh, it's not really that big of a deal. Others have it worse. My trauma isn't that big. So yeah, like minimizing like our own stuff too can be a part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I've experienced something very similar with Liz, with my families, especially even with like teenagers and younger kids. I went to a talk earlier this month where one of the speakers said that, you know, at this point, pretty much every child has experienced an adverse childhood experience because of COVID. Like every child has experienced an ACE because COVID is an ACE, and just the disruption related to that. But I've had kids, especially teenagers, being like, you know, it's not that bad, or like I could have done something different, or I could have changed this, when in actuality they can't. So even at that young age, people are minimizing their experiences for a reason maybe related to stigma, maybe related to just being concerned about how it might be perceived. But yeah, that's definitely a thing.
Okay, that's kind of leading us into a bit deeper. And the next question, actually, I was hoping that everybody would answer, just because maybe you guys have been exposed to different things. I actually wanted to talk about the different kind of mental illnesses that we have, and if you can kind of talk a bit more on what causes them. So in your field, what kind of I think I'm going to start with Cynthia, since she just kind of stopped off. In your field, what kind of mental illnesses have you been exposed to, and what causes them? Those mental illnesses you've been exposed to.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me personally, and I think someone who works with adults primarily might have something a little bit different. But since I work with kids, I see a lot of presentations that can be in like two or maybe three categories. One being internalizing symptoms or presentations where people are feeling impaired within themselves. So that would be like anxiety, depression, a lot of exposure to trauma symptoms kind of would also qualify as being internalizing. And then also externalizing, where you're exhibiting behaviors outwards, either towards other people or in other situations. So that would be like aggression. For like preschool kids, disruptive behaviors, not following, you know, directions, non-compliance, things like that. And then also just general adjustment. I see a lot of kids who have trouble with transitions and changes, especially due to environmental stressors. And then, of course, when exposed to different forms of trauma. That's mainly what I see. And then I guess the fourth category would be neurodevelopmental. So that's a lot of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and then other presentations that have to do more with genetics.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually happy that we have a diverse group. So I know that you spoke more on the young ones and the people that you work with. So hopefully Liz will be able to kind of give us as well her perspective, what kind of mental illnesses you've been exposed to while working with the people you work with, and what possibly causes these mental illnesses.
So I would say I work a lot with anxiety disorders, mood disorders, addiction disorders, some eating disorders, dissociative disorders, and like post-traumatic stress disorders. When I think about like what causes mental illness, I never think about like, oh, it's this one thing, because it's usually a combination of a lot of different factors. I remember in grad school we would talk about it like the biopsychosocial model, looking at like the biological reasons, psychological reasons, and the social reasons. Obviously, for me, since I am very trauma informed, that is like the main thing that I'm usually looking at is like the trauma background. And also like something that we don't really talk about or think about as much or even know that much about is like the intergenerational trauma that we experience. So even things that like maybe my client hasn't been through, but their parents went through. And there's something called like methyl binding that actually causes you to experience some of like those traumatic effects due to previous trauma.
Thank you for that. And also just you talking about inherent, actually. And I'm like, whoa, this is probably something we don't think about, that it can also be inherent. And if you are coming from a family that probably doesn't talk about it, you might not even know that you are actually experiencing a mental illness or a mental disorder. So that leads us actually to our next question. Are these illnesses always visible? How does a person know that they have an illness? Are these illnesses always visible? I think we can always ask Neff. I don't know, Neff, if you want to answer this, or Cynthia.
I can answer a little bit of this. So for when I was doing research on this, for or thinking about this for our prep work, I guess, for for this. So one of the stories I thought of was I was working in a mental health facility where it's like inpatient, and so one of the clients that we had, like he came in and I was still newer to the work, and so he was like, for the lack of a better word, very attractive. And so when I met him, I was like, what the heck is he doing here? Like, because you would think like, oh my gosh, like they're attractive. They seem like they have everything, together for them, whatever. And, as we were doing assessments for him to kind of figure out what kind of needs they would need, because we basically my job was to do an assessment to see what they need and find their, you know, learn more about their background essentially. And as my coworker was doing his assessment, we found out like he really had some like, um, you know, like he was hearing voices telling him to like hurt other people, especially, um, and very psychotic like type behaviors and stuff. But you like just looking at him, like you wouldn't just assume like, oh yeah, he has something going on. And I think that's something that's very interesting about mental health, because a lot of times we have this image of this person that's like crazy, disheveled, maybe they're soiling themselves. Like, we have like this crazy image of what mental health can look like. But at the end of the day, mental health can look like, somebody that's really put together with a suit on, maybe working in a office like as a lawyer or something. Like it doesn't discriminate in that way. So I think his story was for me another example of like, whoa, like this dude looks totally put together. He doesn't look like he would be a person that's like put here, but he was really dealing with some stuff. And so um his story will always be a story that like will stick to me and also remind me, like, not to judge any book by a cover when you're talking about mental illness, because like I said, it doesn't have a specific look to it. So I don't know if Liz or Cynthia want to add to that.
Yeah, I will just say that 100% what Neff was saying. I think, especially with kids, a lot of the presentations for some, because kids can have similar same disorders as adults. The same thing can be diagnosed, but it looks different. And oftentimes, maybe not even oftentimes, I can't even tell you how many times worked with families and parents will be like, "Oh, he's not listening. He's all over the place. He's manipulative. He does this and that and that." And it's like an 8-year-old child. It's like, how can an 8-year-old child be manipulative? And a lot of the behaviors or things that they're exhibiting are manifestations of like exposure to trauma. And what exposure to trauma looks like in kids looks a lot like, externalizing presentations, hyperactive, not listening, non-compliance, and things like that. And sometimes parents or other caregivers might just write that off as being bad, or they're just being a bad kid. So it looks very different in kids, and it doesn't look the same, which I think kind of goes on to our kind of archetype of what a person with mental illness or mental disorder looks like, and oftentimes it's not the case.
Yeah, you actually helped me get into the next question. I was actually going to divert a bit and ask if mental illnesses are not as visible in your different sphere of work. What tips can you give people to look out for? Maybe, is there a certain change that I can maybe see and know that maybe a friend is having a mental illness or a mental challenge or a mental breakdown, or a loved one? Is there something you can give? This is for Cynthia, since she was already talking a bit on it. Is there something you can kind of give us and say, hey, these are the few changes you can kind of see that would help you realize that a person is going through something, maybe if it's not that visible?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I think it depends on the person and it depends on the presentation. But I think one thing that is a kind of helpful marker is if you just notice that some of the things that they enjoy to do or things that they normally would be able to do, they're no longer doing anymore. I know with kids, sometimes if you notice concerns about like, oh, they're not eating as much or they're sleeping more or things like that, not engaging in the activities that they like to engage before, just like a marked difference. I think in like the DSM, if you want to get super clinical, it'll let you know the amount of time, like in 2 weeks or in 6 months or however amount of time, for diagnosis purposes. But if you've just noticed that change, it may not be something that might qualify as a condition that needs to be diagnosed. But I think even noticing that change and calling attention to it and just kind of assessing, oh, how are you doing? How are things going? Can be a helpful first step.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add, like, I think, just what Cynthia said, but then also like if you see that there's changes in like so for adults, maybe there's changes in how they're doing at work. Maybe if you're a student also at school, well, I guess, like if you're a college or a student, as an adult school, but in just even other activities. So like if you're like going to church and things are, the way that you interact with that is different. If you're, well, I said work already, but if you're like even with your family, if there's changes, like you can kind of start to notice like they're acting a little different. And so for I know for kids, that's more like that looks different maybe for like school for them. But if you start noticing a change in how they interact in some of those areas, and it's usually like pretty significant. Sometimes that can be a way to tell like, hey, there's something going on here, and then you can kind of take some steps to explore some of the other options. And I think it's important to start. You could start there, but then take them to somebody that can really help. Specify what it could be, because I know, and also doing a little bit of research for this, like there's more than like 200 different diagnoses, and it all looks really different for different people because there's like different categories that someone can fit in, and like it may look like this in one person, and then another person looks at completely different. So also we have to be mindful that um these things vary based on the person, so you have to kind of look at it a case by case basis. But usually if they start showing like a significant decline in like the activities that they're supposed to be doing, you can kind of start there and kind of go from there.
Thank you for that. And I think I love that both of you kind of highlighted that it depends as well. There's a time frame to it. So maybe there might be somebody who's listening to us and they'll be like, whoa, my friend is probably going through something. But there's that extreme to it. I think in the beginning, most of you guys spoke about how it has to affect your life. It has to affect your ability to live, love, laugh, and learn. So if you see that a person's life has really been impacted by whatever it is that is going on, there's that drastic change for a long period of time. So it could be weeks, months, then you can start getting worried. But just a 1 day change, and tomorrow the person is probably normal. Probably they had a bad day, and it's probably nothing as serious for somebody to get into panic about. So I think it's also just nice to just kind of remember that. But maybe there is somebody who's watching right now, Liz, and they're like, oh my goodness, maybe my mom might have it, or my friend, or I see myself even. Can you help us kind of know, are these illnesses permanent? Are all of them permanent illnesses? And apart from that, how can a loved one or a friend, even a colleague at work or a teacher, kind of help a person that they think or they believe is going through a mental challenge or mental illness?
Yeah. Okay, so there's two parts to the question. The first part you asked was, are these illnesses permanent, right? I I don't think I can answer that like for certain, because I think it just depends. Like, unfortunately, sometimes mental illness can be permanent, but sometimes it is just more situational, like an adjustment disorder or like an acute stress disorder. Um, and even though sometimes it can be permanent, that doesn't mean that like you can't get better, of course, like through things like therapy, medication, taking care of your physical health, like the symptoms can definitely um, start to go down. And then the next part of your question was, what can you do if you see somebody who's struggling? And first today, when I was thinking about it, I was like thinking about, okay, all these different things, like what can you do, what can you do? And then I like took a pause and I was like, wait, first of all, even if like not everyone has a mental diagnosis right now, we're all going through something. Like this has been a really tough year for everyone. So I think like the first thing is like making sure that like you're taking care of yourself. So just like practicing those self-care things and making sure that like you're getting all of the care that you need before you try to like extend care to others. And then when you do have like the energy and the mental space to care for others, I think like the most important thing is like asking somebody like, what is it that you need? So rather than making like assumptions of like, this is what you need to do, just like like, hey, like, it seems like something's been on your mind or you've been struggling. I'm just curious, like, how can I best support you? Like, what is it that you need right now? Yeah.
Okay. I just want to go with a follow-up question for you, Liz. I think so many times, even myself, you get afraid to kind of ask those questions of, are you going through something? Or if you see somebody who's suicidal, kind of asking, hey, are you thinking of committing suicide? So how can a person kind of approach a friend? Let's say right now, maybe I'm in college and I see that something's wrong with my friend. She's kind of changed a bit. She's talking less about love for life. She doesn't have that taste anymore. Her laughter is kind of gone. She's now withdrawn a bit more. How can I approach her and kind of ask these difficult questions and say, can I even ask her, hey, are you thinking of killing yourself? Won't that bring those thoughts into her? She'll be like, hey, maybe that's an idea. Will I give her actually the idea to commit suicide if I ask such direct questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first part of it could be like checking in to see, like, first of all, how close you are to the person, and like if you have a strong connection being the one to do that. Or like if you're in like a circle of people where it's like, well, I'm not super close to Susie, but I know that like Jim is, then like maybe going to Jim being like, hey, could you like check in with Susie and just like see if she's doing okay? Just for that like level of like connection and vulnerability. Then the other part of that is, yeah, I think that there can be a lot of fear for people. Like if I ask somebody, like, are you thinking about suicide? Then you're going to like plant these ideas in their head. But typically, no. Like if somebody's thinking about it, they're already thinking about it. And chances are you're not going to like convince or like put ideas in someone's head. Usually they're thinking about it or they're not. Yeah.
Thank you. And I saw Cynthia was nodding. I don't know if she has anything to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. What Liz was saying, I agree with it. And I think I'm trying to think back of when I was like a first year or like a baby therapist. That was a question I would even be fearful of asking clients about, concerns about suicidality or even intent to harm, out of the fear of like, oh, I don't want to put the thought in their head or anything. And Liz is right. You're not. The person, if they've had those thoughts, they most likely had them prior to you asking, and you asking them about it won't plant the seed in their head. But again, kind of what you can do, as opposed to kind of coming in straight with the fire, like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? You can kind of ask, like, how has your day been? How have things been going? Tell me about, what's going on in your life. And, maybe those questions will kind of elicit what's going on with them. And if you can note, you'll notice the red flags or notice any type of differences. And then you can kind of query about that and get them the help that they need. So it takes the pressure off of you.
And then I was going to add, so depending on your state, sometimes there can be resources of people that can help ask those questions or help with, doing a wellness check and asking those questions. So I know, for example, here in Florida, we have this thing called the Baker Act. So if there's somebody that seems like they might be at risk of hurting themselves or others, like there's some things set in place that people can use as a resource to, check to make sure the person is okay. So, um, I know for me, part of my work with one of the mental health centers here in Florida is we had like a mobile crisis team. And so part of what we would do is we would get calls if there, let's say a parent hasn't heard from their kid in a few days and they had a history of suicidal ideation or things like that, they can call us and we can go to their place and do a wellness check and just be like, hey, well, how are you doing? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Do you have a plan? Things like that. So there were some of those resources, and I know that kind of varies within the states that you, whatever state you live in or what country or stuff like that. But I think that can also be a resource of like maybe checking out your local mental health facilities and see if there's someone that can even help coach you or guide you in some of this too. Because I know it can feel very daunting to have these conversations. And it is also one thing sometimes to have this conversation with like a stranger than it is to have a conversation with like someone that you're really close to and you love. And I know from personal experience, I saw that too, where when I was asking that question to people that I was like, offering services to, and they were like more my clients, like there was still some pressure, but the pressure wasn't as high. But I know also I had a close friend that there were moments where I was like, I had legitimate fears that she might hurt herself. And I had a harder time making that leap to have that conversation. So I think that's something that, sometimes having an outside person can also be helpful if those resources are available in your state or country.
Yeah, and just you as well, kind of saying that I think what I'm gathering from all of you as well is to assess the situation, because not every mental illness or mental challenge or crisis situation can be handled the same because people are different. So, kind of assessing the situation and knowing the person, then you kind of make that decision. Hey, do I call a third party? Will this person trust me? Are we close enough? Who can I go to? Local resources. So to kind of be a bit attentive. And since we're talking about this as well, I wanted to kind of ask all of you, if a person is listening right now and they feel like, hey, you know what, I think I am actually going through something. And what ways would you encourage that person to actually seek for help? How can a person seek for help? If right now maybe a person after listening to us realizes, you know what, I think I'm going through anxiety, or I have maybe depression, how can they seek for help? What would be the first steps you would suggest for them? I think we'll go to Liz and then Cynthia and then Neff.
Yeah. So one of the biggest resources that I found to be helpful to find like therapy specifically is with the website psychologytoday.com. There's like tons of resources for different therapists in different cities, and yeah, it's been really helpful for the people that I know. Another place is NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I know that if you go to that website, there's a ton of resources for different things. And then, of course, like if you're listening to this and it's like you're in the verge of like really, really struggling and maybe even suicidal, like, of course, like going to the hospital or the emergency room is always an option. You can always like bring a friend or something.
Yeah, those are all great resources. I would definitely recommend those too, especially Psychology Today, because if you're in the position to find a therapist, you just put your location and then your preferences in the search engine, and it'll pull up all the different therapists in your area, with all their information and their not specialties, where they are able to do their work. So you can be able to find one. If you're a Black woman, there's also therapy for Black girls that has a whole kind of like yellow page section with different therapists that have put their information on there depending on the area, and it's pretty extensive, so that's a very helpful place to get assistance. And then if you're a younger person, I would also suggest finding someone who you can share this information to that is supportive, because sometimes parents or other caregivers are not supportive of mental health concerns. So if you're able to find someone who can be a natural support for you to help you go through this process. Because oftentimes when we're trying to, seek out supports on our own, once we had one roadblock, it's like, okay, I'm done. That's it. I'll just figure it out on my own. So if you can have someone who will help you and check in on you, that can kind of help motivate you to continue to seek services.
Um, Yeah, I echo what Liz and Cynthia said. I'm just going to add, I know there's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's called SAMHSA, is what it looks like, but there's like a weird H in the middle of that. Um, but I know they have on their website, there's a lot of different resources, especially there's a behavioral health treatment services locator. So if you're looking for, different types of mental health services, whether it's a psychologist, a psychiatrist for medication, um, you know, a licensed social worker, whatever. Like there's different options on that website. I know um, um, the association, the American Psychological Association, and also the American Psychiatric Association, they both also have options on their website as well to help you find practitioners in your area. And just to clarify, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist: the psychiatrist is the medical doctor that can prescribe you medication. Psychologist is therapy usually. So that's why they have two different websites, even though they sound like the same. But they offer an option for you to type in and find psychologists or psychiatrists that are near you. And I know now there's also been a jump with like Talkspace as another resource where they offer stuff online. So if you maybe, especially right now with COVID, if you're not feeling like, okay, I don't want to go in all these offices right now, that could be another option. I know that you can like text your therapist on there. You can, video chat. There's like a lot of different options. And they've been expanding, I feel like. So that's another, I think, resource too. Um, if you want to, start, at least I know I've heard some people, they'll start on Talkspace and then eventually they, make their way to a therapist's office or a psychiatrist's office as well. So sometimes that could be a good space to start, especially if you're like newer to therapy and the concept of sitting in an office or like going to an office can be very daunting. Because I know for me, when I first started therapy, and I was sitting in the waiting room and doing paperwork, they probably could have literally been like a Neff size hole through the door because I just wanted to like bolt. So I feel like Talkspace, if it was available at the time, I probably would have utilized it in the beginning just to get comfortable with the idea of seeing somebody. Um, but yeah, but there's different options now. So I think that's something that's awesome.
Thank you so much for that. So much resources just to go and it actually goes to show that there is a help out there. If you're going through anything, don't feel like nobody cares and that you're going through it alone. There are other people who are also going through the very same, and not just going through the very same, but there is so many resources and so many things that can help you on your road to recovery. There's always a road to recovery. This is not the end of it. As we come to the end of it, actually, I'm going to ask all of you guys to kind of give us a word of encouragement, but it's going to be based more on kind of breaking the stigma. When I did some research, it says that it takes the median age that it takes, the median year actually, sorry, that it takes for somebody to actually reach out for help is usually 10 years. So if a person kind of figures out maybe at the age of 20 that, hey, I think I'm having something. It usually takes them approximately, mostly in general, 10 years to reach out for help. So I think I'm gonna start with Liz. If you had to give actually a word of encouragement to a person right now who is suffering in silence, what would you give to them, and what would you say to kind of encourage them and to help them kind of leap out and reach out for help?
Yeah, that's a great question. Guess I would just say that like you're not alone. Like I've been saying this whole time, like even if you don't have like a specific diagnosis, like this has just been a hard year for everyone and we're all like really going through it. And so yeah, like I think in order for me to be like preaching this to you guys and to everyone else, like it needs to start with myself. And like Neff was saying a moment ago, like I go to therapy. I've been going for like 5 years. I'm on meds. I take Prozac. Yeah, so you're definitely not alone, and there can be like some really beautiful things that can come from this.
Thank you so much. And I love that you came vulnerable. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, that a person can know that as intelligent, as smart, as beautiful as you are, that it doesn't make you weak for going to therapy or for taking medication. Here you are, you're so knowledgeable and you're so healthy. You look healthy to us, that is. And so thank you so much, because I think sometimes we tend to do that. You'll see a person and be like, that person looks perfect. They probably, don't go to therapy, their life looks all in order. And for you to kind of say, hey, I'm strong, I'm here and I'm talking, and for you to achieve everything you have achieved and still go to therapy, get medication, just goes to show that anybody can receive help and it doesn't kind of diminish your value in any way. And so I would throw it to Cynthia. If families right now are going through something, and the stigma that surrounds mental health, kind of afraid to go and look for help because of the stigma and everything, how would you encourage actually families to seek for help for their loved ones or for themselves even?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it's very similar to what Liz said, pretty much almost the same thing, that, you're not alone, especially in the age of COVID. Everybody has gone through this disruption, this trauma, the distress related to it. And the responses that you're having are not uncommon. Like, it's not abnormal to feel stressed in response to a stressor. It's not abnormal to have, kids who are feeling the stresses related to COVID and are acting, in a way that you might not see as helpful, but that's just a normal, response to it. Anyone would respond that if they were hit with the same trauma. So just really trying to, I would hope, normalize it to the audience that it is okay to feel this. It's okay to have these feelings, but also know that you're not the only one, and that seeking help is not like a sign of weakness or anything like that. And then also hopefully being able to feel comfortable sharing this with another person, because most likely they're going through something similar or they've gone through something similar in the past.
Yeah, I think just talking as well, when you talk about the sharing part, I think when we start sharing, a person will be like, whoa, I didn't know this person went through this. So kind of encourages you that, hey, okay, this is a person close to me, especially if it's a friend maybe, or a brother or a sister comes to you and says, hey, I also went through that. You kind of feel a bit encouraged to say, okay, I'll be able to get through that. So I love that you talked about the sharing. Share your story. Talk to somebody. You might just be shocked actually that the person might respond with love, with a warm hug, with some resources and advice as well. So I'm gonna end this actually with Neff kind of helping us. Maybe there's somebody who's listening to this and they're sitting and they're chilling and they're like, you know what? I'm okay. I am healthy. There's nothing wrong with me. What would you say to that person? Because it doesn't mean that if I'm healthy and everything's fine with me, that the community in which I'm, my family or my school, that there isn't a person who's experiencing a mental illness. How can a healthy person, a mentally healthy person, still be responsible and aware of their environment enough for them to kind of encourage and love on others around them who are going through these challenges?
Yeah, good question. So I think with this, I think about like the thing that I mentioned earlier about preventative stuff that we can be doing. Um, because even if you may not be going through a moment where you're having a hard time coping, where you're dealing with depression or you're dealing with anxiety or whatever it is, um, because of how life is, there's gonna be a moment where it's gonna happen. And so I think taking steps to promote um, you know, different things, whether it's like, community building exercises or like programs, like, um, different things. I think we need to be better as a society of doing that. And even just creating spaces where it's okay for people to show their vulnerability and show that they're not okay. And so for me, as we were, you were asking everybody else their final questions, I was just reminded of like, hearing from a lot of my peers and my friends of like how even in the midst of this global pandemic, they're being expected to produce the same amount of work and do the same amount of things. And realistically, we all went into this, what is it, like maybe last year now in March, like being like, oh, okay, like we'll be in this for like a month or two. We'll be able to go back into the office. I think most of us had this in mind, and like a year later of like working through whatever people have had to work through this COVID time, like, we all are seeing like it's just been hard to cope. And then also even the ideas around the conventional 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 hours, those don't necessarily apply anymore, because sometimes because you're home working from home all day, there's no boundaries. Like, sometimes somebody can be emailing you at 7, 8 o'clock at night and they expect you to still be working and doing stuff. And so I think, when I think about that, I think it's so important for us as a society to think about how can we create spaces, whether it's at work, at home, our churches or synagogue, whatever it is. How can we create spaces where we can be open to like letting people set their boundaries, respecting their boundaries, teaching people how to even do boundaries, loving them well, and giving them the space to, like, if they have to grieve, if they have to take a mental health day, not shame them for it. Like, how can we create space like that, and prevent like worst case scenarios happening, especially in terms of mental health, so people having like full on breakdowns. And even I think the hard thing I think about when I think about like even our American system is like so much of our worth and stuff is tied to our ability to produce, that we stop to forget, like, and we stop and forget like people are just, worthy just because they exist, period. It shouldn't be like, oh, you're worthy if you can do X, Y, and Z. Like, you know what I mean? So I think when I think about this, I'm like, how can we create preventative measures to help people not have to experience the worst case scenarios and the worst symptoms? And then if they do have symptoms or they have things going on, what systems can we be putting in place to really help people go through those things and receive the treatment that they need and the maintenance stuff that they may need afterwards. And so I know, like, you know, in all of our fields, we have seen like a huge decline of like mental health facilities, mental health resources. I know something that we've talked about with the organization we work with Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership. One of the things we talked about is how, um, you know, in Maywood, just as an example, um, Maywood, Illinois, for people who don't know where Maywood is, but in Maywood, Illinois, like as an example, they've taken away so many mental health facilities, but yet we're putting money into other resources or other things like police departments or other things that, you know, may not need extra money, instead of actually putting it into, like, you know, preventative things, like programs and mental health facilities and, you know, money for social workers and licensed, you know, therapists and whatever else. Like, we're not putting money into those things. And so I think that's one of the things I'm like, if we can work on creating better treatment options and better preventative options, we can see so many people experience like health, and we can see a lot of more opportunities for people who are healthy. And the, you know, I put healthy like this because I think any of us can struggle at any point, but those of us who are healthy, we can step up and like also help and create more of those systems. Um and so that's why I am thankful for like spaces like this because I think, like Liz said, like, she's, you know, she's gone through her own mental health journey. I've gone through my own mental health journey. The same with you, Cynthia and Rosette. But we're coming here and we're like, how do we create a space where we can invite people into that? And I think that's another example of like how we're trying to do some preventative work. And it's just us sitting here on Zoom, you know, talking and sharing a video about our experiences. So yeah, I say that to say like preventative and treatment options, it varies and we can do so many different things with that. But I think until we actually start doing that, we're not really going to get to help people as much as we can possibly help people. And that's the hard part of a lot of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Nev, and thank you so much actually to Cynthia and to Liz for taking off your time actually and sharing with us. I've learned a lot, and I just loved listening to you guys. I kind of ate all your words, and I'm probably gonna rewatch this to kind of learn again. And so if you're watching us and you want more resources, we have a link that is going to be put under there with more resources and also different ways in which you can get hold of our panelists, our beautiful panelists, very smart panelists. I'm really grateful to be here sharing this platform with you guys. Thank you so much and have a good night to everybody. Remember to try and create an environment of love, of peace, and that you never know who's going through what. So be more loving, and there is hope out there. If you're going through anything, there is hope out there. This is not the end of the road. Try to reach out. We're here if you need any help as well. Thank you so much to everybody. Have a good night.